are in a very strong moment of polarization now. And I think that what we're going to be looking at is whether or not we can pull out of this in a constructive way, or whether things are going to fall apart. And what you can see in my book, for instance, is that we've had both these kinds of solutions. You have complete polarization, say, in Germany in the 1930s. People don't recognize at that point just how dangerous Hitler was. He sounds like a lot of other German conservative politicians. He's just a little bit more over the top, and he's using new technology. So unlike these boring old guys, maybe he's young and he's energetic and there's something there. You could certainly see the same thing in France in the early 1790s. Here's the force of somebody new and different. And if you don't want to join the Republic of Robespierre's virtue, there's a new piece of technology called guillotine, and he'll help you out. Right now, we're at a point where people have a really difficult time talking to each other. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Part of it has to do with social media and new technologies, which are serving to divide people rather than to unite people. Otherwise, going back, as you mentioned, to 2008, the people who brought us 2008 are doing pretty well out of it. The average person in this country, in Western Europe, has not seen that their standard of living has recovered from that moment. And they have a very good reason to ask, what is government doing for me? Is there any reason to believe what I'm being told? I mean, there's an implicit social contract that underlies Western democracy, which is that we give up our independence to live in a society that will make our lives better. And I think that what we've seen in the last decade is that people don't believe that's true right now. And thanks to Twitter and social media and of other sorts of Facebook, you can go and believe something new. But a lot of people believe that they're being sold a bill of goods by their government. And I think that the former president of the United States is really an illustration of the trends that are there. He doesn't cause it. He was president because people were losing faith in their institutions. And then the nonsense that we saw recently, where again, people are willing to believe an outright lie.
It's interesting you brought up Hitler and the evil and the power and the influence of Hitler. I recently had a World War I and World War II historian on the podcast, and I was shocked because I thought the rise of Hitler was inevitable because of the momentum in Germany. If it wasn't him, it was someone else. And he told me, at least from his opinion, that if there is no Hitler, there is no World War II. That in fact, a lot of people in his inner circle disagreed. And there was actually polarization within Germany. And that kind of made me terrified and a bit uncomfortable that his opinion is, without one person, World War II doesn't happen. And that is terrifying about influence.
I think that's absolutely right. One of the difficulties, though, when we think about where Hitler came from, is that, there were a lot of right-wing German politicians who sounded a lot like Hitler. They believed and they promulgated the big lie about the end of the First World War, where Germany had been stabbed in the back. There was a long-term history of anti-Semitism built into German society. The 1920s, 1930s were a period of culture wars, setting the incredibly progressive society in Berlin against the rest of Germany. So we see a lot of these factors that underlie the rise of Hitler. No, there would not have been World War II. There would not have been Nazism without Hitler. It's interesting that there was a slightly right-of-center observer of the time said, well, it's either going to be Hitler or Thalmann, the leader of the Communist Party. But he couldn't identify the fact that Hitler is qualitatively different from that. Um, and but you wouldn't have had Hitler if you hadn't had the First World War.
It is such a powerful thought that one person had that influence and that power. And I certainly was under the belief up until that conversation that the society and the momentum and the culture was inevitable. Clearly, I was wrong in that. And speaking of history, I wanted to ask you, is there a major risk or a measurable inaccuracy when we look back on history because the winner so typically rewrites the story? Is it dramatic enough for us to put an asterisk by some of our history, or is it small enough where we could brush past the winner rewrites?
I'd like to think that it's small enough to brush past the fact that winner rewrites because we know what happens. And we also know how to look for other people's stories. We know how, and this has been really one of the most important things in historical studies in the last, say, 30 or 40 years. I mean, when we look back to what the profession looked like in the 1960s, in the 1970s, it was very common to hear historians say, this is our view, this is the truth, the single truth, because our truth is opposed to the falsehood of communism. What people were not looking at was the fact that there could be multiple perceptions of history. History is not the same for women as it is for men. History is not the same for African Americans as it is for whites. That what we came to recognize is that there are different stories. They are all stories that we have to take account of. And that one of our tasks as historians is correcting the implicit bias in any of the narratives that we happen to get. One of the most interesting stories, I think, in this country is actually how the losers rewrote history. When you look at all of these Confederate statues around the South, which started going up in the 1870s, 1880s, and into the 1920s, as a new narrative of the Civil War was being promulgated by the resurgent white political society in the South.
One of the strangest moments for me in terms of finally having an aha moment about winners rewriting history in some capacity was being in middle school. I'm Canadian, so I was in a Canadian social studies class or history class, and I kept hearing that the Americans won World War II, and without the Americans, World War II wouldn't have come to an end. And as I got a little older and read a few select books and some documentaries, I started to realize that we left out the Soviet Union pretty dramatically in that. So I would ask you, who won the World War II, and is the U.S. presence overstated amongst North American kids in school?
The U.S. presence is certainly overstated. I think it is fair to say that that if there hadn't been the United Kingdom continuing to resist the Nazis, and Hitler could have unloaded on the Soviet Union with his complete military force, he probably would have won the war. So you can't say that it's only the Soviet Union that won the war, I think. It was the Western Alliance, which supported the Soviet Union, which did indeed do most of the fighting. But you were talking about just how much influence an individual could have. When we look at what was going on in English politics in the spring of 1940, if Churchill hadn't become prime minister, it is entirely likely that Britain would have made a peace treaty with Hitler, and we'd be living in a different world.
Do you think after the tragedy of World War I, World War II, and the anti-war movement, especially people my age thinking that war is genuine stupidity in many cases, is there an existential threat for a third world war? Or is that overblown for political points, swaying fear votes? Or is the war machine so big financially? Is there a genuine existential threat for a third world war? Or has it been a little bit overblown because we have learned from history?
I'd like to think it would be the second. On the other hand, one lesson that we have learned throughout history is that stupidity is occasionally invincible. The outbreak of the First World War, everybody said, oh, well, this will be over by Christmas. And again, the theorists of war were sitting there saying, well, the global economy is too interconnected to be able to afford any kind of massively destructive war. And people who should have known better, who should have known the destructive power of the weapons that had come into being, just ignored that. If we go way back in time to the period just before the Arab conquest, the two great powers in the world were Rome and Persia. Both of them had suffered terribly from environmental crisis, the arrival of the bubonic plague, but they went to war with each other for 20 years and effectively destroyed each other. It should have been obvious to people that they could not afford this, but ideologically, that wasn't the way it works. And ideology will very often trump, I don't want to use that word, will overcome reality in many cases. So it's something to be very careful about. Right now, I would say that the chances of a third world war are very, very unlikely. But I could give you a whole slew of reasons for that, which would sound like somebody in 1912.
Going back to disruption and the polarization that we're experiencing, I know myself and a lot of people my generation firmly blame social media. But looking back on history, there was also when radio came, I'm sure that scared a lot of people. And when the printing press had, like, technologies have always happened and caused change and caused polarization. Is social media just today's technology, or is it fundamentally different because it's power and range?
That's a very good question. And I think that the way that social media is working now, because it is completely unregulated, is allowing it to play a role that other new technologies, with the exception of the printing press, could not have played. The notion that you can basically say whatever you want, and that there is no need to verify anything, that information can be substituted for truth, that the platforms which post this stuff are not responsible for their content. And this is a question that has recently been raised by Senator Blumenthal in Connecticut, saying that the exemption for social media platforms from the rules governing publishers really need to be looked at. So there's a great deal more responsibility in this. We go back in long distance in time to the invention of the printing press. That was also completely new. There was no government control. There was no regulation of the printed word, aside from creating a bonfire and throwing things on it. But the Protestant Reformation came about in large measure because Martin Luther and people, especially Martin Luther, were really, really good at making use of a technology that the establishment had simply failed to understand. They had failed to understand that mass communication was suddenly possible in ways that they hadn't imagined.
In Chris Bale's book, he talks about that 6% of Twitter users are responsible for 73% of political tweets on the platform. Do you think that maybe, as loud as it seems, seeing the data that such a small portion of people are the loudest and the most polarized is freeing or comforting in some way? Because it might seem like every single person is shouting, but the numbers suggest that it is a relatively small percent.
Well, the problem is really not just the shouters, it's the listeners. And if people are believing what's being shouted, then the fact that it's just 6% are going off the deep end isn't what I'd be looking at. I'd be looking at how that small group of people, relatively small group of people, is shaping such a wide range of opinion.
That's actually a very good point. And I always wondered about someone who is considered moderate doesn't have very much upside to be active on social media politically because of the business model of the algorithm. I look at myself or any friend that has a very obvious and mundane opinion. That won't get shared. That won't go viral. That won't get a retweet. That won't create a storm. But so even beyond the people that are shouting, the moderate has zero advantage because the entire business model is for shocking clickbait and virality. So it is in many ways the actual platform to blame because the business model is based on shocking virality instead of mundane opinions.
I think it absolutely is. And I think that one of the things that we need to think about in a world which is heavily polarized is that centrism can actually be radical. That's saying, I'm trying to create the space where two different groups of people can come together and have a reasonable conversation in this environment is far more radical than saying that the election was stolen. That's just a lie. But saying, I need to be able to bring these people together and get them to stop shouting at each other, or not even shouting at each other, they're shouting at the different groups, creating a common ground for a conversation. That is actually my version of contemporary extremism right now. And we've seen it work a few times in the past. I mean, one of the most important examples actually was with the framers of the U.S. Constitution. They went to war to end big government. Then all of a sudden, what we find is a few years after the peace treaty with England, largely former officers of the Continental Army and their general are meeting in Philadelphia to put together a document that will be the foundational piece for a large national government. But they were able to do that because they were able to create middle ground to have a conversation. And what I think I can say that I see the Biden administration trying to do is also to convince people that government can actually work for them. A large infrastructure bill, if that can be passed, the success of the rollout of the vaccination program. We're not where we want to be completely right now, but when you look at the success of the Biden administration getting people vaccinated and compare that with so many other countries in the world, maybe that will help people come back and say, okay, maybe I don't need to believe this lie and this lie and this lie over there. And maybe I don't need to believe, that somebody who's not going to attach themselves to the furthest wing of opinion might actually have something worth saying.
That's I guess the moderate fear and skepticism in behavior change. So even just personally with this podcast, I have a deep fear of bringing someone who is on either extremes because I don't necessarily believe that I can change that person's behavior. And also, I'm probably going to offend people on both sides. So even the idea of trying to be inclusive and win through ideas, do you think that's our only option, or are you skeptical that behavior change is even possible once you're hitting those fringes?
Well, it's difficult. I got to say, it is very difficult. But that, I think, is where history comes in. If we see what the consequences for this level of polarization actually are, if you look back over time and you say, my God, here's the center collapsing and disappearing in France in 1793. Welcome to the world of the guillotine. If we look back to Russia in 1917, see what the consequences are. And maybe we can start a conversation saying, okay, we really do need to move back to the center. We do need to recover the voices of people who can communicate across party lines, rather than just doing what we so often do is see people yelling into an echo chamber of their own thoughts. And maybe we can finally get people to say, I shouldn't believe something that is a lie.
Should we demand the responsibility of social media platforms? Because on one side, they are private companies and they're set up to earn profit. They're not supposed to be for the well-being of society or for political peace. They are for profit. But on the flip side, and this is going to sound literally ridiculous, but as a young person who grew up with social media, people in my demographic average 6-8 hours of screen time on social media. It almost doesn't seem like these are companies anymore. It's almost like shocking that they're private companies because they're a part of our lives. They're ingrained in our lives. They are a part of us in many ways. So how do you balance you're a private company and you're here to serve your shareholder and earn income, and the government stepping in or the people demanding that social media start becoming responsible to try to create peace in society in some capacity? And maybe that's an algorithmic change. Maybe that's getting rid of the certain status viral systems. So what are your thoughts on it's a private company, but it's so much bigger?
Okay, because we're live, I won't use the two-syllable word that came to mind immediately in that. Frankly, government has regulated monopolies in the past. And to the good of society. Government regulated the railroads. Government has regulated media for years. The laws on libel have been here forever. One of the curiosities is because social media companies have been allowed to declare themselves platforms, not publishers. They're not responsible for the lies that they propagate. If they were newspapers, they could be sued. If it was a television network, they could be sued. So we have seen a lot of actually positive government regulation that has broken up monopolies in the past when the level of control of those companies has become so great that they have influenced the way people are living their lives.
Seems to be like an element of beyond the social platforms, the person that is very vocal and loud and creating the polarization. There's an element of like human nature. And I'm sure this is very, very unpopular for a lot of people. But whenever I look at somebody that is shouting and screaming for 12 hours a day online, I try to look at it with empathy, and I almost look at it like they're in a cult and it's almost a tribal sense and they want a feeling of belonging. And that is very human. So beyond the platform and the technology, there's a struggle that every human wants to feel belonging. They want to feel a part of a tribe. They want status on the platform. And regardless of what Twitter and Facebook do, humans are going to be humans and they need to belong. And unfortunately, some people find belonging in some pretty scary things.
Well, I think that that's certainly true. And I fear that the situation that we've been living through in the last 18 months has enhanced that, because your ability to get out and to maybe be part of a conversation that's a bit different, to talk to somebody new, to have an interchange that isn't filtered through electronic media, hasn't been there in anything like the same way. And I wonder if some of the deep polarization that we've seen in political society has been in part because people will not be in a place where they can talk to somebody they don't agree with, or who doesn't share their views. But it's also the case, of course, and I mean, there's a lot of writing on the subject, of surveillance capitalism nowadays, about how social media companies are really primarily interested in keeping people fixed in place, because then their interests and their wants are predictable and can be controlled by the feed from the company.
Shifting back to history and my generation specifically, do you think young people have a hard time getting motivated and inspired to learn history because they can't figure out how it relates to the present and the future? And while I believe that the history is incredibly important to look ahead to the future, it seems like a lot of young people have a disconnect where it's like, that's the past, things have changed, we have nothing to learn, people were bad. Do you see that? And how do we fix young people getting motivated about history because it also matters in the future?
Well, I think it's up to those of us who are professional historians to communicate what it is that we're interested in and why we do what we do in a better way. I mean, there is a tendency to think of history as a really kind of dull collection of facts and figures. That's not history. History is a process of analysis. It's a process of discovering patterns. Why history is significant going forward is that it shows us what kind of situations can arise. It shows us what kind of patterns to be careful about. I mean, we were just talking, I think, about the 1930s. And we were talking about deeply polarized, dysfunctional societies, which allowed for catastrophic end. If we can see that in the past where this kind of polarization has led us, it helps us realize that we need to think towards a new set of solutions. When we look at some big changes, and I think all of us can agree that there need to be some big changes, that so many people have been cut out of prosperity that they have every reason to expect as hardworking people they earn, that there can be very positive ways forward where radical change has taken place, where a new kind of center ground has been created to promote the kinds of conversations, actions, and policies that can lead to a genuine improvement.
Looking back on the moments of change and disruption, for me personally, I talked about 9/11, 2008, this pandemic. And of course, the Industrial Revolution was another moment, huge moment of disruption. But looking forward, while it's very tough to predict, it seems like AI is going to be the Industrial Revolution times 100.
Well, I think one of the things that we are seeing is that the speed of change is becoming so much greater. And in fact, that makes it all the more important to be conscious of what options we can be facing. When we think about the Industrial Revolution, we're talking about a process that lasted for the better part of a century and basically simply kept the people who were in power at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in power at the end. The people who had money at the beginning were able to industrialize and become much wealthier and more powerful by the end of it all. What we are looking at with artificial intelligence is to what extent are human beings being replaced, and how can you maintain a valid lifestyle? What will you change for people if they're not doing X because the machine is doing it? What can they do that they would otherwise not have done? How do we manage that kind of change? Because what we don't want to see is the result of having the machine delivering sandwiches on the street, which I see around here nowadays, is that there is no job to replace that for the person who would otherwise be doing it. So how do we expand opportunity around the new technology? That should be our central question.
I guess there's also this big question mark whenever anyone talks about AI and economics. It is, does artificial intelligence create more net jobs, or does artificial intelligence destroy more net jobs? My fear is that it's going to destroy more net jobs, but I wanted to ask you about that big question. Do you think with new technologies of the past, we adapted, they ended up creating prosperity and jobs, or is AI far different? Actual intelligence is far different than automation.
Well, many of the big changes in the past, technological changes, did open up entirely new ranges of possibilities. From the invention of the printing press to automation, there were a lot more different jobs. It didn't look like that would necessarily be the case. But what you found was you were not trying to produce the same quantity of goods and services. You were increasing the goods and services that you could produce. So ideally, with the introduction of artificial intelligence and smarter machines, we will be increasing what we can produce as a society, and that will be a positive for people in the long run. But we do have to be careful that we keep that question in front of us. And what is the end result going to be? What are we looking at as the ideal conclusion to this? And how do we prevent opportunity from disappearing as opposed to opportunity being created?
Whenever you hear like Andrew Yang talk about automation and AI, his concern is that AI widens the wealth gap, that there's no more middle class, there's super rich, there's super poor, which leads to Andrew Yang's next point, which is UBI. I wanted to ask you about that. UBI in the context of 2021 looks a lot different than UBI in the context of 2041. Or is it generally a good idea, or does AI need to accomplish a whole lot more before that becomes feasible?
You can say that AI will need to be managed. I think that Andrew Yang, one of the problems with what Andrew Yang is arguing for, of course, is again that if you have your own basic income, you're being stuck in place. Oh, you've been taken care of. And that's what I would worry about with these proposals. Not saying that you're establishing a baseline below which a person can't fall. I mean, we've had that principle in society for a very long time with welfare and social security, that they haven't kept up with the needs of people. But the idea of a baseline is fine. But what I worry about is saying that this is like Amazon. Oh, we've solved all your problems. We're paying you $15 an hour. Now, who defines place by place what a necessary basic income is going to be? It's going to be one thing in Riverside. Is going to be another thing in Wyoming. So that there's a lot of difficulty with this concept, and I think that we're better off trying to find ways of managing the future that are going to enable everybody to move ahead without trying to stick them in place.
Yeah, I'm in downtown Toronto, and my baseline would be a lot more than the middle of Canada and the middle of the prairies based on rent and living. So there is a lot of nuances. And another argument I see all the time about UBI is distrust in politicians primarily. And that distrust is a politician's goal one is to get elected, goal two is to get reelected. And if politician A wins based on $1,000 a month, what's stopping politician B 4 years later saying, well, I'm giving $2,000 a month? And that cycle can speed up. So there's also a distrust politically with how they would use that as their advantage.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's something that that you really very much need to be aware of. I think we're on the same page here, or same screen. Yes.
So going back to your book as we're winding down, was there an initial spark for you to write this? Was there a moment of change or disruption where you said it's time to write this book?
Absolutely. It was the Charlottesville riots. When we were watching the President of the United States supporting people who were violently opposed to the government of the United States, people who were out to celebrate exactly the antithesis to the values of this country. And so, I mean, I tend to see that Trump is really a symptom of a deeper problem. He's simply not bright enough to do anything else. But why is it that we got to this place where we have somebody like that as President of the United States? And as time passed, and I became all the more excited about writing this book and thinking about what are these patterns of change? How do we lose faith in our own institutions? And what are the possible ways around it? Is there a constructive way forward, which is what I really hope that people take away from my book, as well as being aware of what it is that can happen if we aren't concentrating on finding that constructive way forward.
By definition, great change has two paths. Either things change for the better and society is happy and prosperous, or they change for the worse. Things don't stay stagnant over a long period of time. So, looking at in history, looking at your book, Change and Disruption, knowing that there are only two paths, great change or destructive change, how hopeful are you in 100 years when we're both gone, in society, in politics, in economics? Are you hopeful or are you deeply concerned for the momentum that we're on right now?
I think everybody should be deeply concerned, but I am also very hopeful. More people voted for an avowedly centrist candidate for to be president of the United States than ever voted for any other person in the history of this country. I think the will is there to come back together and to be better than we have been, to confront real problems and look for real change, and hopefully to learn, from the experience of the previous 4 years, what it is we could expect if we do not find a way to move forward together.